exploring different facets of the Belfast Blitz. This year, as I'm sure you all know, is the 80th anniversary of the Blitz. And both the Public Record Office in Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland War Memorial were keen to mark what was a historic and probably the most devastating attack ever on the city of Belfast. And I should note, it wasn't just Belfast, but actually Belfast, Derry and Bangor were also hit. I'm going to invite Alan Freeman from the War Memorial in a minute to introduce our speaker today, Brian Barton. But before I bring Alan in, I just want to go through some housekeeping. Firstly, everybody is muted, and that's because there's so many of you here today. The background noise alone would just mean you wouldn't be able to hear anything. There will be a question and answer session at the end. We'd like you to put any questions in the chat and just right away as Brian is speaking, and we will come back to you at the end. My colleague Lindsay is going to look after you for that. Today's talk is being recorded and will go out on YouTube. So if you don't want your face appearing in the recording, we would encourage you to set your video to off. Whenever the video is available, there'll be a link from both the PRONI site and the War Memorial site, so you'll be able to get in both ways. I should say the stub spaces for the next 4 talks in the series. They're all at 2 o'clock. They're all on Thursdays. The next talk is next Thursday, and I'd encourage you to come back and hear both that talk and each of the following. Next talk is by Trevor Parker, and that will be on Emma Duffin, who was a VAD commandant at Stranmillis Military Hospital. And Trevor is going to go through her diaries, which he transcribed. So we encourage you to come back next week for that. So I'm now going to try and pass you over to Alan Freeburn to say hello from the War Memorial and introduce Brian. Unmute. Unmute. Sorry, Alan, could you unmute?
Yeah, gotcha.
Okay.
So I just want to say thanks to Stephen, and that we here at the War Memorial are very pleased to get our lecture series up and running. Just looking how over the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at different aspects of the Blitz and how Northern Ireland was affected by it. And we're looking forward to sort of a series of discussions and sort of particularly from quite prominent and authoritative voices on the Belfast Blitz. We're very pleased that you could all join us today as well. I'm very conscious of time, so I don't want to go on for much longer, but I just want to quickly introduce Brian Barton, as historian, author, and least of all, trustee of the Northern Ireland War Memorial as well, as in a historical advisory capacity more than anything else. I'm sure he'll agree. So I'm just going to pass you quickly, and I'll make my way down my own laptop as well. Yep, we go.
Good afternoon. I'm very glad you're able to join us this afternoon. I'm just going to give a sort of quick run over the Belfast Blitz, starting off with whether, looking at the degree to which Belfast was adequately prepared for the Blitz, to what extent the Blitz was expected, to go through a sort of summation of the raids on Belfast, and go through also some sort of summary conclusions at the end. I'll be showing slides throughout. And just on the question of to what extent Belfast was prepared for the Blitz, this photograph shows J.C. McDermott, who was the Minister of Public Security in Northern Ireland from June 1940, who was responsible in order for preparing Belfast for the Blitz, of Northern Ireland for the Blitz. And his comment was that in relation to Belfast's preparedness, that Belfast was less well protected than any major city or port in the United Kingdom for the Blitz. And that's true if you look at really any aspect of the active and active defences and passive defences for the city on the eve of the Blitz. As far as shelters were concerned, there were enough shelters just to hold a quarter of the population of Belfast if it had been fully utilised. Very few people had been evacuated. They were estimated by government officials to be 80,000 school children in Belfast at the time of the first raids. There were 22 anti-aircraft guns, which was well below what the Ministry of Defence had recommended. There were no searchlights. There was a small flight of barrage balloons, and there were fighter aircraft, Hurricane aircraft, which had come in July 1940 from Edinburgh, but they weren't able to operate fully or properly. They weren't equipped for night flight. In some ways, it would seem to be sort of surprising that Belfast should be so ill prepared because it was so vulnerable. This photograph shows the sort of dock area, and you can see how vulnerable it was at the head of the loch. Shortland Harland's Harland Wolf lay just so easily found, you'd feel. The telephone exchange wasn't far away. This works. There railway stations, the power station, all within a relatively small area. In addition to that, after the fall of France in June 1940, Belfast became even more vulnerable in the sense that after the fall of France, the Admiralty redirected shipping from the Channel area, the Channel ports, to the Western ports, to places like Liverpool, Glasgow, and of course Belfast, which increased the flow of trade and numbers of convoys using Belfast. And also then, in addition to that, the Luftwaffe were able to occupy air bases in northern France and in Holland. They no longer had to come all the way from Germany, which again made Belfast more vulnerable. Why Belfast was less well prepared than elsewhere, I think is down to a number of factors. Partly, it was a feeling that in Northern Ireland that the city was too remote. 1,000 miles return trip from Germany. That was too insignificant. Why would the Luftwaffe send aircraft across Britain to reach Northern Ireland when the British targets would have been regarded as being more significant? The fact that Belfast was so long immune from attack right through to the April of 1941, after all, the Blitz in London started on the 7th of September 1940. That long period of immunity built up the feeling that it was unlikely Belfast would ever be attacked. In addition to that, there was the fact that air was neutral, Southern Ireland was neutral, and that again encouraged people to feel that the might respect Irish neutrality. Visitors to Northern Ireland often commented on here in Belfast, and you can see that on our next slide here. One of the professional observers came over and he commented on this scene here, the numbers of people sunbathing outside the City Hall. He commented on this and some of the other sort of habits of the local population, and his comment was that if people were to behave in that way, say in Liverpool or Glasgow, it could well have started a riot, whereas here it was taken just simply as normal procedure. There's hardly, you'd hardly have known there was war on, the observer said. However, the likelihood of Belfast being attacked, there was a growing sense amongst politicians and civil servants, both in Belfast and in Britain, that Belfast would likely be attacked. Certainly by the end of 1940, that feeling was building up. I mean, partly that was down to the fact that by then, Belfast industry and commerce had expanded. There were something like 11,000 workers in Shorten Harlands, 23,000 then working in Harland Wolff. There were something like 17,000 troops based in the Belfast area, and that increased the likelihood of it being attacked. So the politicians and officials reasoned. And as well as that, there was the fact that the Luftwaffe were clearly becoming more active over Northern Ireland. This photograph shows the first steamer to be attacked. They were laying mines, the Luftwaffe, and this shows the first steamer to have been sunk. It's the Trout Pool in Bangor, 20th of July, 1940. 11 of the crew died. The ship that has been struck, you can see in the background there with smoke coming from its bow. The laying of mines in the Belfast Lough was happening more or less on a daily basis from July 1940 onwards. Luftwaffe were also overhead in the sense that they were taking reconnaissance photographs. These are two photographs, one of Derry, one of Belfast, and the photographs were taken significantly in the November of 1940. And again, obviously you can see they're marked up with the targets in German and pretty obviously the one on the left and the Belfast one. And these activities of the Luftwaffe were being noted. One of the results of the increased activity of the Luftwaffe over the city was that there were 22 red sirens, red alerts in Belfast between the 25th of October and the first raid on Belfast in April 1941. All of it indicative of the increasing traffic overhead of German aircraft. Another thing that the Luftwaffe were doing was drawing up what were called target files. These were discovered by British troops when they entered Berlin at the end of the war. These were to guide Luftwaffe crews whenever they did eventually attack Belfast. And this one, obviously in German, relates to the dock area, provides details of the shipyards at Harland Wolff and the Shorten Harlands aircraft factory. The target folders contained, or target files contained photographs that contained printed accounts of the targets, describing their position, their strategic significance, the strength of the local aircraft defenses, position of anti-aircraft guns, etc. So that obviously these were being built up. All the major strategic targets in Belfast had Luftwaffe target files written up for them by the end of 1940. Another thing which caused concern in Belfast as well was that from the January of 1941, the Luftwaffe was increasingly targeting the Western ports, as they were called, Glasgow, Liverpool, Bristol. And that was alarming because it seemed likely Belfast would be next. And J.C. McDermott, advised Johnny Andrews, the Prime Minister, on the 29th of March 1941, in well-known words, that he said that up until now, we have escaped attack. So had Clydeside until recently. Clydeside was attacked on the 13th, 14th of March. He went on to say, Clydeside got his blitz during the period of the last moon, full moon, the period of the next full moon, from say 7th to the 16th of April, may well bring our turn. That was a remarkably sort of prescient comment to make because it was accurate virtually to the day. The first significant raid in Belfast, at least the first raid in Belfast, was exactly 80 years ago today. On the Monday, Tuesday, it was 7th April the dockside raid took place, or the wee raid as sometimes was referred to. The attack started at midnight, roughly 12 o'clock. It lasted for until 3:30. It's often described as being the wee raid, but in fact it was a massive raid as far as the UK overall was concerned. 500 aircraft set off from bases, German bases, to attack mainly Great Britain that night. Clydeside was the main target. There were never more than eight of them over Belfast at any one time. And as they say, for about 3.5 hours, they sporadically attacked Belfast. It's not clear really why they did attack. I mean, particularly as the numbers were so small. Sometimes speculated that it was a sort of trial run for the serious blitz that came later. Alternatively, there's some evidence to suggest that it was because of the bad weather in Britain. Some of them, more or less by chance, crossed the Irish Sea and attacked Belfast. The places that were attacked, when there were some bombs fell in North Belfast, Alexander Park Avenue, etc., near Grove Park and so on. There were some bombs and incendiaries in East Belfast, and Patrick's Church of Ireland Church, that's your vicinity, but 800 incendiary bombs fell on East Belfast. But the dockside raid was a good description of it, because most of the bombing occurred in that area. The most serious fire was at McHugh Dix, the timber merchants. The fire spread from McHugh Dix to neighbouring premises. It was the biggest fire of the night. 12 of the 13 civilians who were killed in the raid died in the dock area. And the worst sort of damage was done in the dock area in the final minutes of the raid. The last bomber, about 3:30, literally the last bomber in this raid, swooped down over the loch and dropped 2 parachute mines. One of them struck Ranks Flarnell, and the other struck Harland and Wolff. The name of the pilot was a man called Siegfried Rothke, who was subsequently interviewed, and he indicated that his assigned target had been Dumbarton. Dumbarton was under heavy cloud, likewise Glasgow was, so he headed across the Irish Sea to clearer skies to attack Belfast. So he was basically there over Belfast entirely by chance. The bomb, the parachute mine that he dropped on Harland Wolff, struck the Alexandra docks. You can see them very clearly here, an external photograph and an internal photograph. Massive site, 4.5 acres, pretty much razed to the ground. Quite substantial casualties, because whenever the parachute bomb was coming down, some of the workers saw it from shelters and surged toward it, believing it to be a German pilot or a German crewman. And that increased the number of casualties, or resulted in a greater number of casualties. It was evident that I should say the Alexander Works were where the fuselages were made for Sterling bombers, foreshortened Harlands. They were made in Harland and Wolff. The likelihood of the Luftwaffe returning was great. I mean, that was filled in Belfast at the time. It was fueled by the comments by Lord Howe on the radio, Germany calling, talking about Belfast having Easter eggs, over the Easter period. That the Western ports were continuing to be hard hit. Bristol, for example, and there were the squadron that was manning the barrage balloon in the dock area. In its diary, it recorded that in the nights of 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th, they were aware of Luftwaffe overhead. so that there was a high level of Luftwaffe activity. Not much could be done, however, before the Luftwaffe returned. Searchlights were brought in on the 10th of April. There hadn't been any before that. And the other thing that was done was the introduction of a smoke screen, very crude contraptions, more or less. They were set alight, furnace type structures, small wee furnaces were set alight, and they exuded this noxious smoke, which was its intention was to conceal the sort of square mile of the dock area. That was introduced on the 11th of April and manned by the troops. Whenever people talk about the Blitz in Belfast, what they normally are referring to really is the Easter Tuesday raid, which happened on the 15th, 16th April 1941. It had been expected and predicted really by J.C. McDermott. And he anticipated a severe raid, but where the bombs were directed towards and the impact of the bombing was something which the government was totally unprepared for. The raid started about 11:20, lasted for the best part of 5 hours. Belfast was attacked by, it's estimated, about 180 aircraft. They dropped about 200 tons of high explosives, 30,000 incendiaries. The raid was preceded by flares, something it's estimated again, by 300 flares, which made the city light up like daylight. People wondered what was the point of the blackout when the skies could be lit up so effectively by flares. What surprised the city authorities and the government was the concentration of so much of the raid on North Belfast, the Antrim Road area. And this can be, the streets are sort of associated with this raid: Unity Street, Atlantic Avenue, Hillman Street, Burke Street, Duncairn Gardens, etc., Hogarth Street. Those are the ones that are sort of burned into the memories, the folk memory of the Blitz, and all of those streets are in North Belfast. To illustrate just some of the damage, this is a photograph of Victoria Barracks, which was beside off Clifton Street, and you can see there quite extensive damage. The Surrey Regiment was based there, 13 casualties, and very extensive damage was resulted from the attack there. Also, just another example, Trinity Street, again off Clifton Street. The church, Trinity Street Church, had been where an ARP post had been located, and 7 ARP members died in that bombing. The biggest number of casualties in a single incident during the course of the raids. 17 people in all died in Trinity Street. Another one, which is again very well known, many of you will recognize that, and you'll see the really large remains just scattered on the ground there of the Atlantic Avenue shelter. That was Atlantic Avenue. 38 people were killed whenever that shelter sustained an indirect hit. It wasn't directly struck. And another example in North Belfast, this is the Sussex Street, Vere Street area. It's beside York Street Mill. And one of the bombs struck one of the rear walls of the mill. The mill was, as you can see, 6 stories high. And whenever the wall disintegrated, it collapsed onto the small terraced houses in the immediate area. And a consequence of that was 40 people died. You can see on the left-hand side of that photograph, that thing that looks like a sort of post box, but that was one of the sort of furnaces that were used to operate the smoke screen. So there was the North Belfast was very, very hard hit in the course of this attack. And it's led to sort of speculation as to why the Luftwaffe should have attacked North Belfast. Of the hundreds of people who died, just 8 of them died in the dock area in the course of this raid. So the docks was by and large very little affected by it. Nothing really of military consequence was damaged or was struck, and yet the docks were easy to vacate, as we really have established. And the explanation which is commonly and popularly put forward was that the Luftwaffe mistook the waterworks for the docks, and therefore they bombed the area around the waterworks, assuming them to be the docks. You can certainly understand how or why the Luftwaffe did miss the docks. There are a couple of reasons. One would be the very bad weather. Belfast had something like 9/10 cloud cover, according to the Met Office that night. 90 aircraft that were designated to attack Belfast failed to find it and diverted to other targets. A lot of them went to Liverpool. Another reason was that the dock area was obscured not just by low cloud, but also by the smoke screen. The military heads, the military OC, and also some of the industrial heads in Belfast, Short and Harlands, for example, they felt that the key thing in protecting the dock area had been the smoke screen, that had caused the Luftwaffe to miss the docks. And some of the public felt that. One diarist noted that people said it was cruel to put up a smoke screen over the docks, as it meant that their houses were bombed. And also another thing you could bear in mind would be that the bombing techniques were very crude. It was an inexact science. And it's clear from the Luftwaffe's own records that they attempted to bomb Belfast by sight, despite the very poor visibility. And another point, just in conclusion, is that the docks were actually hit. This is a photograph of Queen's Works in Harland Wolff, which was badly damaged. But the two things sort of saved the docks. One was that the fires in the dock area were very quickly extinguished. So in other words, whenever succeeding aircraft came over, the fires were extinguished, and they didn't, they went to the areas where the fires were already alight. And also a lot of the bombs failed to explode. There were something like 10 parachute mines, military reports suggest, found after this attack in the dock area, embedded in mud, etc., which had failed to explode, fell harmlessly and didn't explode. An interesting thing, just on the nature of this attack, is that the Luftwaffe's reports, what did the crews think after it was over? And their comments were dismissive of this raid. They said that the result of their bombing, and I'm quoting from the Luftwaffe's own reports, were not known, but they concluded that the result would be unsatisfactory, that the raid was abortive. It would only have a mediocre result. The effect would be minimal. So there was, they knew full well that they hadn't hit their targets. They had no idea really what they'd hit, but they knew full well that they hadn't hit their targets. And that was borne out subsequently whenever the Luftwaffe sent over reconnaissance aircraft. It was quite evident they hadn't hit their targets. Apart from the area of North Belfast, other parts of Belfast, of course, also suffered. City centre, not so much. Everybody knows the D.J. Murphy and the Ulster Hall, where 800 were attending the Killie there. Generally speaking, the city centre more or less escaped in this attack. South Belfast, likewise, though there were exceptions. Bly Street, East Belfast has experienced some serious incidents. Thorndyke Street, for example, 20 people killed when the shelter was struck there. Templemore Avenue Hospital. A diarist, again, in East Belfast, at the end of this raid, noted the sky was red, pure red. You would have thought that someone had set fire to the world. Also in West Belfast, There was considerable damage in some of the worst incidents. Wilton's, the funeral parlour or funeral service, where 47 Black Belgian funeral horses perished, but also places like Ohio Street and Heather Street, where 75 people were estimated to have been killed. And of course, this Percy Street site, where a shelter was struck and something like 30 people were killed. It just shows you, the photograph on the right, the scale of the destruction in Percy Street as a result of that bomb. The photograph on the left shows the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester touring that part of Belfast, 21st of April, trying to raise morale, though they said themselves, as they put it, that they were shocked by the state of Belfast. The gentleman on the right there, in police uniform, is the city commissioner. His name was R.D. Harrison, and in the course of the raid, he advised that the aid should be called in from elsewhere, from outside Northern Ireland, and he suggested that actually the aid should be called in from Era, from the south, and that is the case. Of course, help was called from all regions of Northern Ireland and from Great Britain, and also from Era at 4:35. At the very end of the raid, aid from Era was summoned and was dispatched. You can see here the Kearns book for Drogheda on the left, and it describes just briefly what time they left at, what time they got back. It says that De Valera had given us authority, his approval for them to go up to Belfast. The photograph on the right shows is a photograph of some of the Dundalk firemen who came to Belfast. They also came from Dundee and from Dublin, something like 13 engines in total and 17 men. Outside Belfast, there were also bombs dropped, as already has been mentioned. At Newton Ards, 13 military personnel lost their lives at the Newton Ards airport. And you can see it here in this photograph on the left-hand side, a photograph of Messine Park in Derry, where ex-servicemen's houses were struck and 14 people were killed. And on the right-hand side, a bomb dropped on Hazeltine Gardens in Bangor. In total, 5 people were killed in Bangor. The death rate from this raid was extraordinarily high. The reasons for that, there was estimated that something like 740 people were killed in this attack. This is the memorial at Milltown on the left-hand side to those who were unidentified and buried there after this attack. The reasons for the very high death rate, estimated about 740 civilians were killed. The reasons normally are sort of obvious. One is the large numbers of bombs that fell on housing, and densely packed terraced housing, working class housing in the north of the city especially. That's Eglinton Street on the right-hand photograph there, where there was military posts as well, and there were extensive casualties. This is Burke Street, which basically was obliterated in the course of this attack, not a house left standing. And this photograph here is of the burial register of St. Patrick's Catholic Church on Clifton Street, Donegal Street, Clifton Street area. And that is the burial register for St. Patrick's, and it lists the names of those from the parish who died in the Vere Street, Sussex Street area as a consequence of the York Street Mills collapse. 34 names are listed. So it just is showing that as an illustration of the extent to which the houses provided no protection whatsoever, really, against the intensity and severity of the bombs that were being dropped. An interesting feature of the raid was that the injury rate was low. People who were caught up in the Blitz were killed by it rather than injured by it. Numbers of persons injured, but 420. The number who died, 740. Also, another feature was that very few people died in hospital. Just about 50 people died in hospital, whereas, you know, where they died was in their own homes, in the streets, in their shelters, rather than in hospital. All the reasons for the high death rate, the fact that the shelters were enough of them, and generally speaking, they seem to have been insufficiently well used. Also, that so few women and children had been evacuated at the time of this attack. Half of those who died were women and children. The fact that the defences were so weak. In this attack, even though it was almost twice as long as the next raid in May, the number of shells sent up was really quite small. And there's a reason for that. At about 1:15, these bombs that are in this photograph fell in Cromwell Square near Telephone House. And after that, really, the anti-aircraft guns fell silent. And the reason for it was that the bombing here at Telephone House at 1:45 actually at the time damaged the telephone exchange and disrupted the vital radio signals between anti-aircraft gunners and their control room. And as a consequence of that, orders were sent out not to waste ammunition by firing shells speculatively into thin air without any radio signals to give them the position, height, speed, etc. of the Luftwaffe approaching. So another consequence of the Easter Tuesday raid was the severity of the death rate. The fire is out of control from about 1:15. After 1:45, virtually no active defences. The anti-aircraft guns falling silent. The death rate really much higher than anyone in government had ever imagined it would be. The government had expected at most 200 deaths as a consequence of any air raid in Belfast. The other thing which shocked the authorities was the scale of the evacuation, people getting out of the city. There's a very well-known photograph, Belfast Telegraph photograph of evacuees. During the course of the attack, literally during the course of the attack, and of course immediately afterwards, there's this surge of people leaving Belfast. Again, the authorities, government had never expected anything like that sort of scale of evacuation. People leaving by bus, tram, train, car, bicycle, on foot. Something like 100,000 had left the city within about 10 days. By the 25th of April, 5,000 had got as far as Dublin. They just got out in fear and panic, anticipating that the Luftwaffe would return, aware now how inadequately protected they were. They were just anxious to get out. And of course, on top of that, you have large numbers who ditched, who didn't leave the city, but who in tens of thousands, literally perhaps as many as 20,000 or more, went out of the city at night time and stayed out until the early morning, came back whenever they felt the fear of a raid was over, that there was no likelihood of a raid, and they came back. Again, it was likely the Luftwaffe would come back to Belfast, would attack Belfast again. Again, it was predicted by Lord Hoche. He talked about giving people time to bury their dead before the Luftwaffe would return. The Luftwaffe would have known that their Easter Tuesday raid had been a failure, and therefore it was likely to come back to identify and hit their targets, their primary targets. And again, the attacks on the western ports were continuing, on Liverpool, for example, especially. So again, that increased the likelihood that surely Belfast, as another western port, would be likely to be attacked. And then there was little that could be done in terms of trying to improve defences in the period which elapsed between the next raid. One thing was done was the killing of dangerous animals at the zoo, 32 dangerous animals. And the other was the increase in the number of anti-aircraft guns from 22 to 28. But again, I mean, it's a marginal increase. The last big raid, as far as Belfast is concerned, happened on the night of 4th, 5th May. The fire raid, very often referred to or described as. It was shorter, but it was more intense than the Easter Tuesday raid had been. It started later. The Luftwaffe were keen to get away before daylight and thinking of their security going home. They wanted to avoid daylight hours. 200 aircraft attacked Belfast on this occasion. They dropped 240 tons of high explosives, and it's an estimated 100,000 incendiary bombs, which is a colossal number of incendiary bombs. Outside of London, no other city experienced so many on a single night. On this occasion, the brunt of the attack struck East Belfast and the city centre, and again, to some extent, North Belfast. In East Belfast, really they succeeded in hitting, the Luftwaffe succeeded in hitting basically all its primary targets. There's a photograph of the Queen's Yard and Victoria Works at Harland Wolff. 2/3 of the buildings in the shipyard were destroyed. Everything wooden was incinerated, burnt to the ground. War damage claim after the raid was something like around 2 million, was the biggest single claim. It was the worst single amount of damage done to any shipyard in the United Kingdom in the course of the war. You can see from this photograph the scale of the damage in East Belfast. This is St. Patrick's Church of Ireland Church in East Belfast, the Lower Newton Arch Road, and you've just a scene of total devastation. The terraced houses literally wiped off the map, essentially there. This photograph, and you can bear in mind, incidentally, that 80% of the workforce at Harland Wolff lived within 2 miles circumference of the shipyards itself. So clearly, that was a lot of that had been the housing occupied by shipyard workers. This photograph gives you some sort of sense of the scale of the bombs and the just total inadequacy and lack of protection provided by the housing, the terraced housing at Ravenscroft Avenue in East Belfast. Other parts of North Belfast struck, or East Belfast, I should say. This is Campbell College, which was at the time operating as a military hospital. 13 servicemen who were receiving treatment there died in the course of this attack. City centre was also severely damaged, as you're well aware. I'm sure just a few photographs to illustrate. This is Bridge Street, not many buildings left. You can just see in the distance, or distant, well, the bank on the left-hand side, that bank, of course, still survives. The only building left on Bridge Street was the only building left was the Norton Wig, which survived but was burnt out. The building itself, though, survived. This photograph of High Street, before and after photograph, really. The second one, the one of the damage looking up toward the clock. And you can see just the total on the whole sort of north side of the High Street, just absolute devastation. The Arnott's, the shell of Arnott's, as you can see in the foreground there. In some local gossip was that one of the Luftwaffe bombers had actually crashed into that area because of the scale of the damage there. This shows the International Bar that was at the corner of Donegal Street and York Street, up toward the cathedral. In other words, just on that corner where the art college is. International Bar, one of the best known sort of places to socialise in Belfast at the time, and totally devastated, never rebuilt. And that's the other photograph shows the cleared, after the debris had been cleared, or at least the buildings had been dismantled. And this last photograph shows St. Anne's Cathedral, lucky to have survived. That photograph taken on the 8th of May, as you can see, and still the smoke rising, still smouldering. The damage to the city centre was such that the military OC felt that the city centre must itself have been a target. So much bombing took place in the city centre area. Also, North Belfast suffered severely. The York Street Mill here was struck again. Massive buildings, 300 yards by 100 yards. The fire at York Street Mill, which resulted from this fire raid, was reputedly the biggest fire in the history of the city. Certainly the devastation is obvious looking at that photograph. Other areas struck in North Belfast. The LMS railway station is the marshalling yard, and it's a scene of just total devastation as far as the eye can see there. And the consequence really of the attack, by the end of the attack, there were something 200 fires had been ignited, 200 large fires out of control, most of them out of control. And again, the help was called in from outside, from the south, from Era, 220, before the, more or less halfway through the raid. And again, help is called from Britain and to other parts of Northern Ireland. On this occasion, I should say, before we move on, I won't go into that yet, the death rate was lower than it was after the Easter Tuesday raid. The reasons for that would be roughly 190 or so were killed, civilians were killed in this attack. The reason would be that so many of the bombs fell in the dock area in the city centre, where there weren't that many people about. It was a Sunday night. There were fewer people in the city centre. The docks, it was a Sunday night, and the workforce generally hadn't gone back to doing night shifts since Easter Tuesday raid, so there weren't many in that vicinity. Also, the defences were stronger. The anti-aircraft guns operated throughout the raid. They were supplemented in this attack by the HMS Furious, the aircraft carrier, so that again put up greater resistance. The shelters were better used than had been the case on Easter Tuesday, according to Warden's reports. And also, of course, so many people had been evacuated from the city. 100,000 had fled from Belfast after the Easter Tuesday raid, and this attack in itself helped to accentuate that trend, with more people fleeing from the city. At peak, something like 220,000 of the city's citizens had left by mid-May, had fled from the city by the middle of May. That was really the last significant attack on Belfast. You can see from these items here, the Luftwaffe was elated after this attack, unlike after Easter Tuesday. The Luftwaffe reports, the crew reports, claimed that practically every one of the crews claimed to have hit their primary targets in the dock area. This was covered very extensively in the German media. The crews claimed that as they went back to their bases in northwest Europe, that they could see the fires over Belfast from the Welsh coast and from the Lancashire coast. They claimed they could feel the vibrations from the bombs as they fell to a height of 3,500 meters. There's just some of the extracts from the reports. And it also was extensively reported in the press, the German press. The photograph on the left is from Der Adler, showing just the dock area of Belfast in smouldering and Der Adler was the Luftwaffe magazine. The Völkischer Beobachter was the Nazi newspaper from 1920. And again, you can see headlines for Belfast. It's the only time in the war that Belfast hit the German headlines. But the claim was that Belfast had suffered beyond recovery. It had been devastated. Its war production had been wiped off the map. That was the claim. And many people in Belfast at the time might have actually identified with and felt there was a lot in that. One of Emma Duffin, who I know is Trevor Parker is giving a talk about, she describes in her diary having found after this attack a scorched page from a child's notebook in her garden after this attack. And she said she found at the top of the page it said, just inscribed the words, the end of the world. And her diary comment is that it was certainly the end of the world as we knew it. And obviously many people might have felt that after the severity of this attack. In fact, actually in Northern Ireland or in Belfast, unemployment fell substantially in the course of 1941, in the course of in other words, this year. And lots of reasons to account for that. One would be that the orders from British ministries, the War Ministry, Ministry of Aircraft Production, etc., more of them were coming to Belfast because the British industrial sites were fully stretched and they needed to put the orders over to Belfast. Also, there was work in clearance, blitz clearance. There was work also in blitz preparation because it was assumed the Luftwaffe would return again. And people left or enlisted after the raids out of a sense of wishing to get some sort of retaliation against Germany, and therefore they joined up. There are instances of that. Others went across to Britain to work, or they found employment looking after the growing numbers of British and American troops that were based in Northern Ireland. At peak, about 100,000 British forces were billeted in Northern Ireland, and at peak, about 120,000 American troops were based in Northern Ireland. From January 1942, this photograph here just shows the arrival of the American troops at Dufferin Quay, 26th of January 1942. And the next photograph shows that blitz preparations were still continuing. As I said, there was an assumption that the Luftwaffe might very well return. And even as late as the July of 1942, in other words, a year after the Blitz, these water tanks were still being constructed in Belfast. This is a water tank that has been constructed in High Street. You can just about make out High Street on the left-hand side there. It was sometimes called Blitz Square, that area. And a water tank put in there. The problem with in the Blitz period had been the shortage of water. So these large water tanks, which would provide water in the event of a further raid. The photograph on the right shows Chichester Street, where they were laying down steel cables to bring up water from the port area, so that it would be available to fight fires again in the event of another raid. As I said, something like 5 miles of steel pipe was laid to lay water into what were regarded as being high risk areas, bring the water up from the docks. And also, I mean, you should bear in mind that the shelters were being constructed. They were still being constructed as late as October 1942. The peak building of shelters happened about the autumn of 1941. The last photographs here are just sort of some defining images of the latter days of the war. Like obviously, the Luftwaffe never returned to Belfast. They did bomb Dublin, of course, the night of 30th of May, 31st of May, but they never returned in strength to Belfast. And these last photographs are just to sort of highlight some of the defining moments in the latter stages of the war and at the end of the war. This photograph here shows, first of all, on the left-hand side, the warships assembling in Belfast Lough off Bangor in preparation for D-Day, 6th of June, D-Day. Something like 30,000 crew members were aboard the ships when they'd finally all collected and then set off on a convoy round toward the Normandy area. The photograph on the right shows the U-boat U-293 coming alongside the jetty at Lissahallie. In the court, the U-boats were instructed to surrender, and the formal ending of the Battle of the Atlantic took place on the 14th of May on Lough Foyle, the formal surrender of the U-boats at the end of the Battle of the Atlantic. And then finally, a couple of photographs of VE Day, the 8th of May, Donegal Place, City Hall, the biggest crowd seen there since the signing of the Covenant. And you can see again, interspersed there in the crowd, the water tanks, 2 water tanks, which had been put up again to provide water in the case of a bombing, further blitz. And the photograph, which is, I think, quite a poignant photograph of the some servicemen in Belfast Cathedral on VE Day, solemnly in prayer and in reflection. Obviously, there's a lot to ponder over. The war in Japan was still going on. There, no doubt some of their comrades would have been killed in the war period. Also, possibly in the Blitz itself. There was not a complete mood of elation in Belfast at the time of the VE Day. There was a sense of relief and so on, obviously, that the war was over. But also there was a sense of worry because of the prospect or possibility of even the likelihood of a return to sort of recession, depression in Belfast. 1943 was the year of peak employment in Belfast in the war period. After that, unemployment tended to creep up. So there was apprehension as to what the future might bring and whether it would bring back the depression of the interwar period. When you think of the Blitz in Belfast overall, just a few final comments. Belfast had fewer raids in many of the major cities in Britain. Glasgow had 11 attacks. Liverpool had something like 74 attacks. The Home Office statistics provide those figures. Belfast had ready as 4 attacks. It was a minor one on the night after the fire raid on the night of 5th, 6th May. But 2 of those attacks were major attacks, the Easter Tuesday attack and the fire raid. So in a table of the worst affected cities in the UK, compiled by the weight of bombs dropped, Belfast comes 12th in those tables. And the casualties were substantial. The total number of civilians killed, certainly well over 900, adding in military deaths, it certainly approaches 1,000 total deaths. Alan Freeburn will be giving you a talk on the casualties, which he's done a great deal of work on. This photograph is of the city cemetery, showing a memorial there. 154 people in total who were unidentified dead were buried there in the aftermath of the 2 severe attacks on Belfast. Not only a very high death rate, obviously, which is the real tragedy of the Blitz, but the housing very severely damaged. I think half the houses in Belfast, 56,000 houses destroyed or damaged, roughly half of the city's housing stock. roughly half the city's public elementary schools. Something like 60 places of worship were damaged. So it's not surprising that the whole experience of the Blitz has been so deeply etched into the folk memory of the citizens of Belfast. That's reflected, I think, in the drawing of these these murals. There's one on Hogarth Street, but there are others in various others, Percy Street, for example. There are others in various parts of Belfast. And it just shows how deeply the experience of the Blitz lives on in the folk memory of the citizens of the city. Hogarth Street was the street perhaps most severely affected by the Blitz, something like 80 deaths in the Easter Tuesday raid in Hogarth Street. Jimmy Doherty, the warden who wrote his book Post 381, he says in that book, which is a wonderful book, that he describes the Blitz as being the most disastrous event in the history of the city. And it'd be difficult to disagree with that comment. The only just one other thing I should say in conclusion is that until now, there's never been any memorial erected to the victims of the Blitz, roughly 1,000 victims of the Blitz. There's been for a good while now, a memorial to the Titanic victims at City Hall. Now, however, there are plans, the British Belfast City Council has agreed plans to put up a war memorial, a memorial to the Blitz victims. Almost certainly it'll be in the grounds of the Cathedral Gardens, just beside the cathedral and where the new University of Ulster building is being erected. And it's hoped that that might be constructed next year in 2022. And it is a welcome and timely and belated, if belated, acknowledgement of the sacrifices of the wartime citizens of Belfast. Thanks very much for listening to me.